Thank you so much for being a part of this webinar. We're really excited to put this on with some great partners and friends from across the country. My name is Dylan. I'm from Just Leadership USA, and we're going to hear from some amazing organizers and activists over the course of this webinar. The webinar should be about 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to take some time at the end for questions. I would just ask any people who are registered for this, who are attending this webinar, who want to ask a question, to use the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions during the webinar or that you want us to come back to at the end, please just sort of use that, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. But other than that, we can go ahead and dive right in, and I'll sort of give a quick introduction of what we're doing and what we're going to be talking about today. I think most people who are here today probably know that this is a pivotal moment in criminal justice reform and in the political history of the United States. And it is becoming clearer than ever before that those two fields, those two worlds are inextricably linked. So one of the things we want to be able to do is recognize what that connection is and how we can utilize that connection to really drive the reform movement forward. Just Leadership USA is an organization that was founded on this value that those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, meaning that the people who've been most impacted by the criminal justice system should be the men and women on the front lines of reforming that system, of fighting for meaningful change and overhaul of that system. Unfortunately, though, the reality in many parts of this country is that those folks who've been impacted by the system are barred from what many would consider the entry point into the political process, which is the act of voting. And that's exactly what this webinar is about. It's about the challenges that people face when they have justice involvement in their past and now want to participate in the voting process. It's about what we collectively and individually can do to overcome those challenges and help our communities overcome those challenges. And it's about why that matters so much, to go back to that opening theme. An overview of what's at stake over the next several years, beyond the partisanship and the elections, what's really at stake with the reform movement in this political moment in the country. So I just want to introduce briefly our presenters who you'll be hearing from today. We have Neil and Devin from the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, an amazing organization doing some groundbreaking work in Florida around these issues. And for those of you who have been following the news, Florida is really at the cutting edge in some ways of some of these issues in terms of being front and center in terms of what's happening and what could happen in the near future. We have Christy from All of Us or None, Charlotte. Christy, one of the premier organizers in the country around these issues, someone whose own experience has certainly led her to fighting for some real changes in the system, and someone whose experience lends a lot of expertise and insight that we can all learn from. We have Stanley from prison cells to PhDs, prisons to professionals. Stanley is someone whose personal story, I think, speaks volumes, not just about what's at stake here, but about why this should matter to anyone and everyone who cares about the future of this country and the future of criminal justice reform. And obviously myself and my colleague Alex from Just Leadership USA will be here to sort of just moderate the webinar and make sure things go as smoothly as possible. And again, if you have questions throughout the webinar, we definitely encourage you to ask via the Q&A box that's available at the bottom of your screen for all the participants. So without further ado, we can go ahead and just take a brief look here at the overview of the webinar itself. Part one, we're going to open up with Neil, talk about an overview of the current laws and sort of where things stand. And part two, we're going to kick it over to Christy to talk about organizing in impacted communities and about sort of what we can do for ourselves and for our neighbors to sort of overcome some of the challenges that exist today. And part three, Devin's going to sort of talk to us about why this is so important, about why voting is such an integral piece of criminal justice reform and of the reform movement. And in part four, we're going to hear from Stanley about his experience with these issues. So again, thank you all for being here. Very excited about this. And without any further ado, I'm going to kick it over to you, Neil. So take it away.
Oh, great. Hey, thanks, Dylan. I really appreciate you, Alex, the whole Just Leadership team for putting this together. It's a timely issue. We're honored to be a part of it. Yeah, so this kind of first slide here, I think, oh, if you can go back there. For me, it really gets to the heart of what it is that we're talking about, the heartbeat of our movement, and that is the people who are impacted. So real quick, just a little bit about the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. Ours is an organization that is made up of formerly convicted returning citizens, as we like to call ourselves, people who are impacted family members, and we advocate for policies and for changes that would help people's lives, everything from criminal justice reform to economic policies to, I think one of the things that's really front and center for us right now is Amendment 4, which is on the ballot which is on the ballot this November, that would allow people to earn the eligibility back to vote for people who are formerly convicted, returning citizens that have paid back their debt to society. But I think in terms of framing up the whole conversation, my hope was to just kind of really talk and remind all of us that the heartbeat of the movement is actually the people, that this isn't, sometimes when we start talking about voting, I think it turns a lot into a political science exercise, which is vital because we need to be experts in our craft. But at the core of our work really is about people's lives, families, communities, and the ability to help make lives better for those people. So if we could just get onto that next slide, I'll dig into kind of the basic facts of felon disenfranchisement and kind of what it is that we're going to dig into a little bit further. And just so you know, like when I think of like the basic facts, we're really just talking about the numbers and re-emphasizing the fact that states are different, that each of the states are in charge of their voting policies. There's a lot of historical background on the origins of felon disenfranchisement, which I know we'll get into further. We can dig into in questions. There's kind of demographic differences, impact different communities in different places a little bit differently. But ultimately, what we're trying to just frame up for our conversation's sake is the basic numbers and what we're dealing with. And so, according to the Sentencing Project, you can see here on this slide, and I think we all know who the Sentencing Project is, but they're a fantastic nonpartisan organization that does data analysis and keeps updating that. So according to the Sentencing Project, there are 6.1 million people who are unable to fully participate in their community because of a past felony conviction. So before kind of just stopping for a second and thinking about what that means, I mean, that's 6.1 million people. Like, that's bigger than the state of Wisconsin, bigger than the state of Missouri. That's about the equivalent of the state of Tennessee. Like, that is a lot of people, a lot of families, a lot of folks who are impacted by these policies. So each state is a little bit differently. And obviously we do a lot of our work in Florida. So I know for my presentation, there's a little bit of a Florida bent here, but for instance, that 1.68 million of the disenfranchised people in the country actually live in the state of Florida. And that is because of the differences in the state policies, which we'll get into into the next slide if we could. So felon disenfranchisement laws vary by state, right? So that's a pretty basic statement, but how much do they vary? It actually is quite a large variance when you really start to think about what somebody's life would be like in the different states based on the different policies. So for instance, in Maine and Vermont, you can vote, prisoners are allowed to vote. You can vote in prison. There are 14 states that allow people to vote upon their release from prison. There's 18 states that allow people to vote after completion of prison, parole, and probation. And then again, from our perspective, we look at Florida as one of 4 states that permanently bans people from voting because of a past felony conviction. And obviously that's one of the things that we're working real hard to change. If we can go to the next one. But I think what's really important, to make sure that we all keep in mind, and that is like looking at how things change. Like, there's a long history of felon disenfranchisement, and there's also a short history. And we can look at the last 20 years, right? So since 1997, and really begin to dig in and see what's possible when you get focused on policies that can change people's lives, and when we get organized and when we work together. Since 1997, we've actually begun to see this pendulum really swing in positive direction. 24 states have modified felony disenfranchisement policies to expand voter eligibility. 8 states have repealed or amended lifetime disenfranchisement laws. 3 states have expanded voting access to persons on probation or parole. 10 states have eased the restoration process for persons seeking to have their right to vote restored after the completion of their sentence. 3 states have improved data and information sharing. So as a result of those various individual state-based reform efforts by folks who are all part of the same movement that we're part of, an estimated 840,000 returning citizens have regained the ability to vote since 1997. I think that's an astounding fact, and something that should give us all encouragement. Frankly, there's been even more added to that just in the last month or so because of recent actions in Louisiana. So there's a lot of great people on the ground, a lot of great people who are digging into the data and helping us to move this forward. And for me, I hope that this little my part of the presentation can at least frame up this conversation a little bit more as we start talking about organizing and what can happen when we work together.
Cool. Thank you so much, Neil. I appreciate that. We're now going to kick it over. And again, I know people might have questions about parts of this, so just go ahead and enter your questions if you have them in the Q&A box, and we'll come back to them at the end. We're now going to kick it over to Christy from All of Us or None. So go ahead, Christy, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Again, Dylan, thank you for asking me to be a part of this so that I can share a little bit about what we're doing here in North Carolina. We can go to my first slide, if you'd like. So a little bit about me. As a result of several criminal convictions and my own incarceration, including a lengthy probation period, I was unable to vote until 2012 when I was 33 years old. And when I was able to vote in 2012, I only voted in the presidential election because that was the one that I thought was the most important. But then I was convicted of yet another crime in 2014. It stemmed from a 2008 investigation. And so then they brought charges up and I was placed on probation again and found myself locked out from the political process. And so I finally got off probation, hopefully permanently, in 2016. And at that time, I became more involved in the political process and began speaking to other returning citizens about their right to vote. And I did that because I felt so uncomfortable going to the poll, not really knowing much, being in my 30s, never having voted at the age of 18 or throughout my 20s. I just felt really uncomfortable and didn't really know much about the process. And so I had to learn about the political process, which races had the most impact on my day-to-day life. And what I found while I was talking to other people is that most returning citizens did not know that they could vote. Because they were being told, like I was told by my probation officer, that once you were a felon, you could no longer vote. And if they knew they could vote, they weren't voting due to not understanding the process. So I decided that I would educate and engage returning citizens in my state so that we could be the change that we wanted to see, and oftentimes the change that we needed to see. Next slide, please. So just an overview about voting. It's one of the most fundamental rights that demonstrates a citizen's connection to and participation in their community. So when we turn away eligible voters from registering or submitting a ballot, we are in essence silencing their political voice. And criminal disenfranchisement laws that were proliferated during the Jim Crow era, were intended specifically to bar minorities from voting. So today, laws that disqualify those with a conviction have had the impact of diminishing the collective voice of communities of color, as well as diminishing the voice of those experiencing poverty. Next slide. Neil gave a great overview of the various states and the statutes there. As he stated, in some states, Maine and Vermont, people can vote while in prison. In other states, as soon as the person is released from prison, they can register to vote. In states like New York and California, everyone can vote except those on parole. So once a person is off parole, their right to vote is automatically restored. They don't need to do anything to petition the state or anything like that. Next slide. Next slide, please.
I changed it, Christy. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Oh, I couldn't see. Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
In Alabama, Delaware, Mississippi, Nevada, Tennessee, and Wyoming, a person's right to vote depends on the type of conviction or the outcome of their petition to the state. And in Florida, Kentucky, and Iowa, an individual must petition the government, no matter the type of conviction. So in these 9 states that I just mentioned, activists must canvass and educate returning citizens on the process of restoring their right to vote, because there's a process associated with the restoration of their right. In North Carolina, where I live, once a person is off probation and parole, their rights are automatically restored. There is no process. They can just go and register to vote. So when I canvass, next slide, when I canvass in North Carolina, I target areas where a lot of people will be. I found that sporting events, festivals, tournaments, concerts, anywhere where people are going to be standing in line for a while. I often go as well to the Department of Social Services because people are standing in line for a while, and they have time to talk and listen while they're standing in line. And so when I'm out talking to them, I tell them that that it's imperative that we be educated on why it's so important to vote. And so I ask those same citizens, not only would they like to be registered on the spot, but if they would help to recruit their friends and families to get out and vote as well. And I use my time to educate those who do not know that people with felony convictions can vote. As I stated earlier, I often hear I, she, he cannot vote because they are a convicted felon. So then I have to spend that time educating people on the current state statutes so that they are clear that they can vote. Next slide. A good way that I have used and found to identify communities is to collaborate with local reentry councils and other community organizations that provide services to returning citizens. So here in North Carolina, Goodwill has a program made specifically for people who are returning citizens. And so I've collaborated with Goodwill, coming in and speaking to them about the importance of voting. And so I've established several collaborative relationships across the city and the county. And so I get permission to come in and talk about the importance of voting. And then again, I offer to help get people registered on the spot. I bring the voter registration cards with me. I make sure that they are signed, and then I take them to the Board of Elections myself so that I know that the person is then registered. And here recently, I've started focusing on those awaiting trial in the county jail because they are people who have not yet been convicted of a crime. So they're eligible to vote if they're not on probation or parole in our state. Next slide. So I also talk to campaigns, right? So this year is a huge election year, especially in the state of North Carolina. We have a GOP ran House and Senate. And so it's been a huge year, and there are 6 flippable seats in the House. And so what I have done is I talk to campaigns and campaign managers and the candidates. I encourage them to focus on people who have previously lost their right to vote by talking about points of interest that I know that they would be interested in. We talk about the political impact of the unprecedented disenfranchisement rate in recent years and how that's not a insignificant thing. It's very significant. One study found that disenfranchisement policies affected the results of 7 U.S. Senate races from 1970 to 1998, as well as the hotly contested 2000 Bush-Gore presidential election. So if disenfranchised voters in Florida alone had been permitted to vote, Bush's narrow victory over Al Gore would most certainly have been reversed, and it would have changed the course of history as we know it. So I focus on recent campaigns as well, where returning citizens played a significant role in deciding which candidate got into office. The latest examples of that would be Doug Jones winning the Senate Alabama's seat against Roy Moore. It was returning citizens who played a hugely significant role in deciding that race. The Virginia's governor's race here recently was also decided by returning citizens being able to vote. And several municipal victories by Democrats in Virginia in 2017 as well were decided by returning citizens voting. Next slide. So when I also talk to campaigns, I appeal to their desire to reduce crime in their area. Crime reduction seems to be on everyone's platform every time a candidate runs. So when they campaign and they talk about crime and their desire to reduce crime, I use that desire to spark the candidate's interest in issues pertaining to returning citizens. I highlight how restoring the right to vote to persons leaving prison could aid their transition back into the community. The revocation of voting rights exacerbates the isolation that we feel when we are formerly incarcerated. We feel isolated from our communities, and our civic participation has been linked with lower recidivism rates. There was one study among individuals who had been arrested previously. 27% of the people who weren't voting were rearrested, compared with 12% of people who did participate in the voting process. And so there are limitations of the data available. And so we can't prove a direct causation, but it's clear that voting appears to be part of a package of pro-social behavior that is linked to a desistance from crime. My hope is that I've provided you all with some useful tips on how to engage returning citizens in your area. And next up, Devin will talk to you about why voting is critical to criminal justice reform.
Cool. Thank you, Christy. That was awesome. Devin, take it away, man. Devin, you there still?
I'm here. Thanks for the wonderful introduction.
All yours, Devin. Take it away.
Yeah, as Neil said earlier, he laid the groundwork, and he talked about FRC and our mission statement. And when we talk about being a grassroots membership-led organization, we run by returning citizens, and we're proud to say that the returning citizens that's a part of our organization come from various backgrounds. We cover all demographics. Next slide, please. And what brought us together is the issue. And anything we do, we keep the issue above the politics, because when we get into politics, that causes division. The epidemic of mass incarceration has stretched across all demographics. And when we talk about the residual effects of the felony conviction, it doesn't care about the race, religion, sexual orientation, or political affiliation. And we think about that in a larger scope. That's what normally divides people, like race, religion, you're a Democrat or a Republican. But one thing about the felony conviction, especially in Florida, it doesn't add any of that. In this moment right here, the conversation about criminal justice reform has finally hit a tipping point, and everybody talking about it. And for the first time in a long time, returning citizens are starting to have a voice. Next slide, please. You know, a few years back, when our prison population exploded, the theory was more incarceration would stop crime. And now the narrative has shifted towards second chances and redemption. One thing that's been noticed is that, you know, most people that go inside will come home at some point. Then another thing is this: a lot of individuals that have felony conviction don't necessarily go to jail or prison. They may be on probation or get time served. Yet and still, regardless of the amount of time or the sentence that they serve, the felony conviction affects their lives forever until policy change. Now, we have friends and family members of returning citizens are starting to play a pivotal role in the progress of criminal justice issues. And I think that's because we're beginning to speak out, right? And what happens when we speak out, we call the elected officials that represent us to start to take note to the concerns that's affecting our families and our communities. Next slide, please. Now, because of the family members speaking out and the voices that they're having, we have a variety of people talking about this issue and a lot of bipartisan work coming on. If you look at the slide from Republican leaders that talk about it and Democratic leaders that talk about it, we're starting to see a lot of progress. I think what's important to note about this list, though, is we have influencers talking about it. We have family members. So my ask is that anybody that watches this webinar, like, actually step up and start talking about this issue and be mindful to talk about the issue from a solution-oriented perspective. Next slide, please. So here we have the role of voter restoration. Returning citizens have access to the ballot box. Right now, if you're a returning citizen and you don't have the right to vote, you are absolutely, completely dependent on the goodwill of somebody else to either listen to what you have to say and find value in it, or speak up for you. Now, when talking to elected officials, you know, it takes votes to win, right? So elected officials are more inclined to listen to voting constituents. And knowing that so many individuals across the country, but specific to Florida, with felony backgrounds don't have the voice at the voting box, it's even more difficult to get that ear. So when we talk about the eligibility of returning citizens voting, that shifts campaign issues. I think that opens a new way of thinking toward a solution: what causes crime, what stops crime. And when we talk about residual effects of it, right? For instance, I'm a parent, and my offense happened in 1999. We're in 2018. I have a child in school, and because I don't have the right to vote. I can't vote on who's in school board. So my felony conviction that happened before I even thought about having a child is having an impact on my child. Next slide, please. Now, we talk about being a change. And in this moment, we really have the opportunity to be the change. Voter restoration means being able to serve on a jury. So now individuals actually have a jury that peers. It also means the eligibility to run for office and pursuing professional employment. So in the state of Florida, for instance, we have 2 board members actually that have law degrees. And one of them, who hasn't had his rights restored, can't sit for the Florida bar. So a prior felony conviction, despite the fact that we have individuals that have gone to college or started to create families and volunteer in the community, none of that is being considered in prohibiting them from fully being restored. Voter restoration means holding elected officials accountable for campaign promises. A lot of times, it's easy to come in and say, we're going to do this for the community. We're going to do that for the community, or we know the community needs this, right? But you don't have a voice. That voice gives you the authority on report card day, which is election day, to say we approve of what you did, or to say let's try something new. Next slide, please. Continuing on from being a change, across the country, we have returning citizens that have had the courage to run for office, post restoration of rights. And I named a few of them. And this is by no means an extensive list, but just looking at the opportunity to present it to us in this moment to support returning citizens that are empathetic, that understand the issues and the hindrances that give us a little more leeway in changing policies that affect us. Next slide. And to keep in touch with the FRRC, we made this nice slide so you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook with questions, or if you want to get connected. And I think that concludes my portion.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Devin. So this is a pretty cool point in the webinar. We've heard some amazing personal stories, some amazing data, and some insight into what's going on and some of the challenges we face. We're now going to kick it over to Stanley, who's going to share a little bit about his story that really ties a lot of this stuff together, and hopefully motivates all of us, if we're not already motivated and fired up by Neil and Devin and Christy, which I think we all already are. But to get a little more fired up about sort of what's at stake and why this work really matters. So Stanley, if you're there, are you still with us,
Yes.
Stanley?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly, man. So I'll kick it over to you and take us away.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining. Thank you, Just Leadership, for hosting and inviting me. As you can see in this first slide, I encourage you all to visit my website, learn a little more about our program, Prison to Professionals, that helps formerly incarcerated men and women obtain higher education. Next slide, please. So in this nation, we incarcerate more people than any other nation in the entire world. That's no news to this audience here, that 2.2 million of our fellow Americans are currently locked in cages. The US accounts for only 5% of the world population, but 25% of the incarcerated population around the globe. That's 1/4 of people locked in cages around the globe are right here in this nation of America. An estimated 70 to 90 million Americans, that's close to 1/3 of working age Americans, have criminal records. So what does this mean? That's kind of a framework of what we all here already know. But what it means is that people like me and others on this call sitting here in front of you are sitting here in chains. So my name is Stanley Andres. I'm a formerly incarcerated person with 3 felony convictions, sentenced to 10 years in prison as a prior and persistent career criminal. I was once told by a prosecuting attorney at the very young age of just 21 years old that I had no hope for change. She said I had no hope. And I'm now sitting here in front of you as Dr. Stanley Andrees, an endocrinologist scientist and professor at not one but two world-renowned medical institutions, Johns Hopkins Medicine and Howard University College of Medicine. I would say that I probably changed just a little bit, according to, her prophecy of me. But I'm still sitting here in front of you in chains. When I was finally released from prison, it was one of the most joyous days of my life. But although I was free, I was still in shackles. I could walk, but I couldn't run. So I used education to break my chains. But even still, I have the remnants of incarceration. I still have the collateral consequences of incarceration. In society's eyes, I'm still a convict, a felon, a career criminal, a lifetime lowlife, a second-class citizen. I still have this mark, this scarlet letter, this bracelet of damnation. Although I am free, I am still in chains. So I want to share a quick story with you. So I once waited at the polls for 3 long hours while this nice little old lady called every public official in the state of Missouri to try and help this excited young man vote in the Obama 2012 election. 20 plus calls later, an answer came back direct from the governor's office, and this nice old lady pulled me to the side, and she was pushing probably 90 years old easily. She pulled me to the side and she whispered to me, "They say you're a criminal." And I gave her kind of a side eye, like, what? And, to my disbelief, she was also, to my surprise, she was giving me the same look of disbelief. And, she mentioned to me that you're not committing any crimes right now. It just doesn't make sense to me that they wouldn't let you vote. So this 90-year-old lady who probably lived through a lot of different things in this country is able to see this simple idea of why would the country be stopping me from voting. This rejection brought me back to my prison cell. Although I am free, I am still in chains. So at that point, I was trusted to make scientific contributions that advance the well-being of our society. But that same society does not want me to vote. So I was brought back to this euphoric agony of the 2008 historic Obama-McCain presidential election. I was locked in a cage at a maximum security prison with 22-hour lockdown, 2 hours of free time, half hour for breakfast, for lunch, half hour for dinner, and half hour for recreation. So we were witnessing the election of the first Black U.S. president. In prison, we had a designated lights out time, but on this night, the guards made an exception and left the TV on so we can follow the election. If I could paint a picture for you, a typical prison housing unit has 1 guard monitoring station, 4 wings, 25 cells per tier, per wing. So that accounts for about 400 inmates per housing unit. As a result of mass incarceration, an additional 50 bunk beds per wing were placed outside of each cell. So there's now 800 people in this housing unit that night, and about 90% of them were Black. I'll never forget how loud it was. People were banging on their doors in excitement. I mean, we were all singing the new Young Jeezy song in unison. I'm sure a lot of you remember it. My president is Black, my Lambo is blue. I mean, it was crazy. It was as if we were a choir of how in unison we were. People were hugging and high-fiving. You generally don't see this type of stuff in prison. But we were hopeful that change was coming. It was a euphoric experience that is burned into my memory. But in the back of my mind, the agony of thinking that I'd never be a part of this experience, that I'd never be able to vote. I wasn't a citizen. I was a criminal. This was extremely painful. Next slide, please. My home state of Missouri doesn't allow people convicted of a crime to vote for a very long time, as was mentioned earlier by a few folks in this webinar. For nearly 17 years, they took away my constitutional right as a US citizen to vote for the people who will run our country. I still can't vote in Missouri. They still don't consider me a citizen, despite all that I have accomplished. Why? Because of felony disenfranchisement. As was mentioned, in Florida, people with convictions will never vote again if things remain the same. Of the Black population in Florida, about 25% cannot vote. It's estimated that soon that will rise to 40% if we don't do something, if there isn't a change. This is because of felony disenfranchisement. Last November, in the state of Maryland, where I currently reside now as I'm working at Johns Hopkins Medicine, I walked into the voting poll location with a sense of happiness and pride. While others were complaining about how long and slow the lines were, I was patiently walking along while inside my head I was dancing like a little kid waiting on a Christmas present. The euphoria was not an excitement for the presidential candidates, right? I was not excited generally about Hillary and definitely, not about Trump. But I had this sense of joy. I've been of the legal age to vote since the early 2000s, yet this was the first presidential election that I have been able to vote in. When I tell my non-criminal justice-minded friends about how I could not vote for all these years, they're appalled. Most of them have no idea that these collateral consequences even exist. So I urge you to know your candidates, know what they stand for, and get out and vote. Thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stanley. That's obviously a really moving experience. And I mean, I nothing I can say to wrap up that story is going to do justice to it other than just saying thank you. And thank all of you for being a part of this webinar. So I'll go ahead and unmute our panelists here to make sure that everyone can hear everything. There we go. So we actually did have a couple of really good questions come in over the course of that webinar. And for those of you who might still have a question, please go ahead and if you look at the bottom of your on their toolbar there, you'll see a little Q&A box. You can type a question directly into there. And I'll try to get to a couple questions here before we wrap up. So one question that I'd love to open up with that came in early on was from Lisa. And she said, to see states like Louisiana pass laws that restore voting rights for those, many of us, for those who have been disenfranchised, many of us are inspired to do the same in our own states. But for those of us who are new to working to change this system and to changing voting rights legislation, what do you think should be the first steps in terms of getting rights restored in our own states? So I'll let whoever wants to hop in on that go ahead and offer some expertise on that. Again, sort of the question being, what are some of the first steps, having been inspired by change across the country, what are some of the first steps for folks in some of these states that aren't doing so well to go ahead and start making that change? Go ahead, Neil. Oh, I think you're muted, Neil. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Got it.
Sorry about that. A couple things jumped to mind. One is an awesome question. I think there's some great leaders in Louisiana. Just doing a quick Google search if somebody wants to get involved. I mean, the Vote NOLA guys. I mean, again, there's a lot of great leaders who do some really amazing work. But I also think there's a mindset shift that I've seen play out as we've built teams and we've worked alongside teams over time, that there's, once you own it, man, you own it. And so this question suggests that somebody is trying to get involved. And I would say that just take ownership of it, own it, and be willing to work together with other people and know that some folks have asked the same questions that you've already asked, and that you can learn from them, get plugged in. And then who knows, where your journey can take you. We need everybody on the field, and people think differently and people come at it differently. And so sometimes that creative spark is necessary for good conversations. But I think there's some great leaders in Louisiana already that you can get plugged into right away.
Christy, could you speak maybe a little bit to your experience I know you talked about sort of why you got started and how you got started, but were there any kind of maybe personal, emotional, or just practical hurdles you faced that you think, had you been aware of them, might have made starting this process a lot easier, and then maybe other people could learn from those experiences?
Yeah, I think touching on what Neil said, I didn't know who to plug into, right? So I just had the idea one day that things have got to change. And so I kind of did it backwards. I kind of started on my own and then along the way met other people. But I think that if I had have seen what was already had been done and connected with those people and lending my views to that, that would have been an easier way. But either way, however the person decides to get involved, even if it's just a social media campaign, you never know what's going to take off and what people are going to share and what people will be inspired and moved by. So even if you just say, I'm just going to be posting statistics regarding my state and just bringing awareness, you can do it that way. I also we travel to Raleigh. That's our state capital. And so talking to legislators and writing, emailing, calling, just being a pest, honestly. And so that when they know they hear Christy Puckett, they're like, oh, you calling back again? I am. And that's the way that, not in a pest in a bad way of accusing or anything like that, but just talking about what the issues and the barriers are. And when that person answers that phone and you can tell why you were affected and how you've been affected, and you put your personal spin on it, they tend to listen, they remember, and then they may be the person that can get you to that legislator.
Perfect. Thank you, Christy.
Oh,
go ahead.
Yeah, just really quick. I think just the awareness piece, and so having the conversation is important. So, as I was mentioning in my story, when I was locked up, I had the understanding that I was never going to be able to vote again. I was obviously incorrect in that. I didn't know that state by state things were different. Most of what I had been told is that, you'll never be able to vote again. So I think just having the conversation for like what folks can do, they just need to start making people aware that this is an issue, and just getting the facts and just get people talking about it, and to understand and really see the personal connection of how this can change lives for not individuals but as communities as a whole.
Perfect. Thank you, Stanley. That's actually a great segue into another question we received, which, Devin, I'd love to kick this over to you to get some of your thoughts on this. Basically saying, as someone who's a layperson in politics, there are obviously easy to see concerns about the voting process and about the impact that disenfranchisement can have on people and on communities. But when you have someone who's just being released from prison or from some form of incarceration, what can we do to make the buy-in a little bit easier? How can we communicate about the power and the importance of voting in such a way that folks who have just now come out of a really traumatizing experience understand that voting is an important piece of the restoration and reentry and reintegration process? I'd say from my experience, I know that one of the things that you always talk about is housing, right? And then you talk about employment and then education, right? And so you have to run down the list before I think a lot of people even consider politics and voting and elections in general. So what are some of the things that you've worked on in the past, or what are some things from your experience you could offer us here that really help lower that buy-in and help people really see from the moment they're released or the moment they're free, the importance of voter restoration?
That's a powerful question. And I happen to have an answer for you. At the FRRC, we understand that it's a circle, it's a total of things, right? So the first thing is not diminish the fact that someone's coming home thinking about housing or how they're gonna feed themselves, things like that, because that's very important. And voting is very important too. So it's about educating them, right? And educating individuals on how local legislation affects housing, how it affects employment and things of that nature. So the individual just coming home understands that, yes, I need this job right now. Yes, I need somewhere to stay right now. No, I don't want to be profiled anymore. And while I'm working on one hand, how to get those things remedied, playing a role in the sheriff's election directly affects profiling. Volunteering and getting involved with city council elections affects things that go on in that district. So they're tied together. And the thing is just finding out how to tie it together for that individual.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Neil or Christy or Sam, do you have any thoughts on that sort of final question?
Well, yeah, I was going to say that people's basic needs are going to be primary when they come out, right? They're going to be very concerned about the food, the clothing, and the shelter. And so and organizations that I work with, because of the collaboration, when I talk to them and they're telling me, well, I can't really worry about that because I'm hungry. So I do the education about how that all is connected, but I also connect them with resources so that can be one less thing that they have to worry about, right? And so I personally make the phone call to a resource and advocate for that person on their behalf so that they can have those needs met. And then when I talk to them they're telling me, yeah, I got that job or I've got that place to live. Now tell me about this voter registration. And they can really focus on what we're talking about. So it's not just you need to vote, you need to vote, you need to vote. It's also hearing where they are and meeting them where they are and then helping them to move to where they identify where they would like to be.
Perfect. Thank you all very much. I know we're sort of running up on time a little bit here, but is there any last minute questions from anybody? If you want to type in the Q&A box. Looks like no. I mean, I will say for our panelists, I don't know if y'all have been following the chat, but there's been some really positive feedback, and I think a lot of people are really appreciative of the time that you've put into explaining these issues today, and really just beyond that, the passion and the heart and the soul you pour into this work. And I personally want to echo that as well. I thank all of you very much for doing the work you're doing, whether it's in Florida or Louisiana or North Carolina or wherever it might be. You guys are doing God's work, and I appreciate that. I also just want to thank my colleague Alex from Just Leadership. Alex was a big part of helping me pull this whole thing together. And without Alex, a lot of stuff doesn't get done, but certainly this webinar has been a big project for both of us, so I appreciate Alex. But again, thank you, Neil. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Stanley. Thank you, Christy. Thank everyone who registered. Thank you for being here. One final note that this webinar was recorded. We will go ahead and distribute the video of this as soon as this thing wraps up, so keep an eye out for that. And for those of you who have friends or colleagues who wanted to see it but weren't able to join us, please feel free to distribute that. We'll probably put it up on YouTube so you have an easy to share link with folks in your networks. But again, just wanted to say thank you again to all our panelists. Appreciate all of you and the work you're doing. And to everyone else who was here today, thank you for your participation, for your attention, for your energy, for your questions. And most importantly, I think on behalf of the panelists, thank all of you for the work you're going to go out and be doing over the next several weeks and months and years. I don't need to tell you all this year is a pivotal year, but every year is pivotal. And certainly we're in a pivotal moment in criminal justice reform. So thank all of you again for what you're doing and what you're going to do. Keep in touch with the folks on this webinar. Keep in touch with the organizations here. Let us know how we can be a resource for you. And we'll go ahead and wrap it there. So thank you, everyone, for being here, and we'll talk to you all soon.
All right.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good one.